Hello book people, PT here. It's The Kindly Ones, volume 9 of the Dream Readalong. So The Kindly Ones, wow. I'm trying to figure out, I was thinking about this for the last couple of days, how am I even going to approach talking about this book? Because it's so much the culmination of everything that's happened previously in the story. I don't think there's one volume, previous volume, that isn't like, doesn't come into play in a fairly important way in this one. It's like all the other stories have all been leading up to this in some interesting way. And finally, the great tragedy of Sandman is laid bare. By the way, this will have massive spoilers for Sandman, of course, as we talk about The Kindly Ones. Neil Gaiman kind of famously was asked if he could sum up the story of Sandman in one sentence, and he said, I'm paraphrasing here so I might get it wrong, but he said something along the lines of, the King of Dreams is forced to change or die, and he makes his decision. And that's definitely what happens here in The Kindly Ones. So let's talk a little bit about, well, first of all, it starts off with a story that wasn't in the Sandman proper. It was in like a book of kind of short stories from Vertigo called Vertigo Jams, where it's like a short piece from a number of their different comics, kind of a way-in for new readers. And that's a cool story. It's told in almost like the first person, like we're a dreamer who's wandering around the dreaming and seeing all different types of stuff happen. And kind of the one important thing that happens in that part is that that's when Matthew the Raven kind of starts asking what happened to all the other ravens, which will definitely be a recurring thing throughout this volume. There's so many thoughts, like the big echoing theme throughout this is endings and new beginnings and change, and we'll see a lot of the reasons why. But I want to talk about the framing device, which the start of every issue of this starts with someone cutting a cord of some sort. I really love the framing device. This one starts with the three fates, the three ladies who are like knitting this piece, and it starts with them cutting a piece of yarn. Basically they're knitting and they're talking about what they're making as they knit, but really, of course, they're talking about stories. And I love this because this is so much Neil Gaiman just talking about, you know, this is a story about stories. This whole, all of Sandman is, and this one is all about endings and his kind of like really blunt thoughts on endings and the difficulties and the frustrations. So one of them was talking about how she likes starting projects better. The other one's talking about endings, and of course they're talking about knitting, but really they're talking about stories. So the one who loves beginnings is talking about why she doesn't like endings, and she says, Humph, I don't know why that's exciting. It's not like anyone notices what we do, not like anyone cares. They're always complaining. They don't like the fit of it, too loose, too tight, too different, too much like everyone else's. It's never what they want, and if we give them what they want, they like it even less than ever. I never thought it would be like this. Why can't it be like the one I had before? I don't know why we even bother. Now the other one says, we bother because we have no choice, because it's what we are. And they go on from there. But then a little bit later in there, they get a fortune cookie, and the fortune is, a king will forsake his kingdom, life and death will clash and fray, and the oldest battle will begin once more. We've had that one before, haven't we? It's definitely familiar, dearie. And that's, of course, from Season of Mists, in that case referring to Lucifer, in this case referring to Dream. And then she says, all good things, eh? Got to finish sometime. She snips the yarn, and the story begins. So I love that framing device, and I love the way he keeps coming back to it issue after issue. And like one of the middle issues is like, man, this is taking a lot longer than I thought. Will it ever be over? Because this is a long volume. But, you know, the basic story is just all the tragedy, all the bad choices that were made. Like really, I think you can look in every single volume previously, except possibly the one collections of short stories, and see like a bad choice that someone made, or a choice that Morpheus made, and in some way it's going to come back to play on him here. Like in Season of the Mist, he decided to free Lucifer. In Doll's House, he told Lyda that he would be back for her baby at some point, which was he surely didn't have to say that. And so like every volume, there's something he did that somehow comes back to him in this volume and adds to the tragedy of what ends up happening to him. I want to talk about the art for a little bit. I think in these Dream Readalongs I've really been neglecting to talk about the art, but really interesting choice here, Mark Hempel. And his style is kind of, I guess you'd say, kind of cartoony and very lots of geometric kind of shapes. Everyone's kind of faces like different, is very could be broken down into shapes very much so. And I thought it was just an interesting style. Almost like this is breaking things, like this story, everything's being broken down, the dreams being broken down. I thought it was cool the way the art style is like being broken down to the basics of art, I guess you could say. So I thought that was a really interesting choice. So throughout this volume, of course, basically the story is the kindly ones are coming after Morpheus through the help of Lyda, who after her baby Daniel disappears wants to take blames it on Morpheus and wants to take revenge against him. And the kindly ones, because Morpheus spilled his own blood, he killed his son in the previous volume, or Brief Lives I guess it was. Because of that they can hurt him, and they end up kind of tearing apart a lot of dreaming. We see a lot of our favorite characters die, some really sad moments in there, and throughout the whole thing, they're kind of almost as a chorus. Matthew the Raven is there, like asking about what's happened to the other ravens, what happens after they're no longer ravens, what happens after we die, kind of a thing. And that's kind of a chorus that goes on throughout here. But I think the amazing thing about this volume is this volume and the next one, I think, are Neil Gaiman at the height of his writing prowess. Sandman, he was writing it for years, and as much as I love those earlier issues, and there's some great stuff, I think at times he does occasionally kind of slip into that, like or rely a little bit too much on his cleverness, and so many like clever little turns of phrase happen and things like that. And that definitely happens here too, but I feel like he's more confident as a writer here, and this is just like a writer at being so masterful and so confident in his craft in this story. There's that whole section of an issue where it's just like Sandman going about his day basically, and it's so beautifully written, and there's some like a little bit of a poem in there, and yeah, he's just so confident in his writing. One thing to mention about this is this story. So when I read The Sandman Companion, and I remember this, not the once that kind of reminded me, but this was the first time, I think, that in my experience at least, that I remember hearing comic book readers complain about writers writing for the trades. So if you're not familiar with that term, basically, sometimes people who buy individual monthly issues complain that they're paying to keep the book afloat, and the writer isn't writing single individual issues. He's just writing for the eventual collected volume, so it'll read well as a collected book rather than giving a full experience each month. And Neil Gaiman kind of talks about that in Sandman Companion and kind of owns up to that a little bit and says, yeah, I think I did do that a little too much in this one, because at this point the books were coming out. I knew this was going to be collected in book form, and probably a lot more people were going to read it in collected form than were reading the individual issues. So yes, I probably did do that a little too much. But for an example, like if you look at the earlier issues of Sandman, and Neil Gaiman's pretty subtle about it, I think, a lot more than a lot of comic book writers, but at the beginning, some point early on in every issue, someone kind of like lets you know what's going on, what's happened before in some way, either in dialogue or whatever. And each time a character comes into the story, if they've been in the story before, there'll be some hints like as to what they were doing before and things like that, and what they're doing. In this volume, he does basically zero of that. He's just expects you to have read the previous volumes when you read this, which overall as a book experience, that definitely did make it a stronger read. But that is something that definitely still goes on today, is comic readers aren't happy that writers aren't giving them a full experience each month and are writing for the eventual collected volumes. And honestly, it's a lot worse now, I think, than it was with this. In this, I think you do have a complete experience with each issue. You've got those framing devices at the beginning of each issue. It's kind of a little bit of a complete experience, where sometimes now when you read a trade, you can't even tell where the actual issue breaks were, and sometimes they don't even mark it in the trade. You can just read it straight through. So anyway, just a little interesting piece of history there, I think. I really love Matthew in this volume. I know I mentioned him a couple times, but boy, what a cool character, and I think we'll get into that as we talk about the next volume as well. But he's like I identified with him so much through this. You could really feel, I think a lot of ways he kind of speaks for the reader, and he's asking the questions the reader wants to know, and he's like wanting to know the behind the scenes stuff that Morpheus is always coy about. Whenever somebody asks him a big question, he just has some clever response that doesn't really answer their question. And Matthew's kind of our guy who's like, no, like seriously, what's going on, and things like that. So many deaths in this too. I mean, Mervyn and Gilbert, the Fiddler's Green, were two of the ones that really impacted me. And then finally we have Morpheus's final conversation with his sister, which I thought was very touching as well. Finally, at the end, we have, as has been hinted throughout, with Matthew and not being the first Raven, and the idea that's referenced throughout. We've already kind of known that delirium isn't the first delirium, so there's enough clues there to realize that when Morpheus dies, that isn't the death of Dream, and Daniel kind of becomes the new Dream, and we see him. He's a lighter version of Dream, basically. Oh, one other thing to point out is the Thessaly. So we finally found out who Sandman's girlfriend was that we didn't know about prior to, who was in a relationship with him kind of off screen, right before Brief Lives, the person who dumped him. And it was Thessaly, the weird witch person from Doll's House, right? So, or no, not Doll's House, from A Game of You. Weird relationship, right? But I think it's really subtle the way Neil Gaiman does it. Like, as soon as they start talking to each other, you know that these two have been in a relationship at that point. Although at first they don't come right out and say it right at the beginning of the conversation. And the artist does a great job too. The way their postures are towards each other and the way they're just kind of awkwardly talking, you can tell what has happened between them. So great job there. Yeah, there's a lot that could be said about this volume, but I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm curious what your take is, and I'm really excited to talk about The Wake also, because I think that Neil Gaiman's super confident in this one, as I said, and I think this is somewhat at the height of their powers as far as writing goes, but I think The Wake is even a little bit of a step up writing-wise from this. So that's going to do it for me, The Kindly Ones. Yeah, curious to see what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you next time.